A close-knit clan with deep roots in the heart of Dixie.
Everybody saw them as the average mother, father, son family.
But behind closed doors, this family is full of peculiar surprises.
It was a secret place to do whatever they wanted to do, and apparently kinky behavior.
From what I could tell, watching the video myself, they were quite scandalous.
It's a seedy world of sex, lies, and blood-red rock and roll.
We're not used to having families kill each other in Iuka, Mississippi. All the suspects fell into place.
Welcome to Iuka, Mississippi. With its time-worn Main Street and shady boulevards, this sleepy town could be the backdrop to a Frank Capra film. The kind of place where nothing too bad ever seems to happen.
Iuka's a beautiful town. A lot of antebellum homes, a lot of Civil War history.
It's just a small, quaint town that's fairly close-knit.
There's even a little magic in the air. Locals claim Iuka's natural spring water has fantastical properties.
Iuka's famous for their mineral springs. There was an old myth that the springs would cure anything wrong with you.
Pity these healing springs can't bring back the dead. Meet Edward. A devoted dad who's always drilled the principle of self-reliance into his family. The Byrams.
Edward was a very positive person, upbeat and very hardworking. He never had anything bad to say.
After a lifetime providing for others, this hard-working husband is finally building something for himself. A man cave.
He worked a lot of hours, sometimes 70 hours a week. He provided for his family. He did everything he could to try to get his family to do better.
Edward loves to shoot home movies. And wife Michelle is his favorite starlet. She's just his cup of tea.
You could always tell Michelle loved the attention that she got back from Edward Sr.
Isn't this awesome?
Michelle Byram was enjoying this part of her life, and it was good for her. She didn't want it to change.
Remodeling has turned up many happy memories. And this couple's future is looking even brighter. But they're about to learn firsthand why you should never play with guns. For now, Edward treasures his naughty wife's sassy sense of humor. She's a real pistol. Across town, another Byram is hard at work on a project of his own. "18-year-old Eddie Jr. is taking his passion for thrashing to the next level. This high school senior lives for rock and roll.
He was always a fairly good guy, outgoing, could be a little bit of a hellraiser.
Very good at music. He could play instruments very well. It didn't matter when, all night, all day. That was just his life.
This dedicated musician has dropped his life savings on today's recording session. There's just one problem. The keyboardist is late.
Give me 2 minutes. Give me 2 minutes.
Some folks just aren't the type to stick to a schedule. Eddie Jr.'s cousin, 20-year-old Eric, really plays the part of a rock star.
Eric Byram was very loud and very unruly.
You get out of here. 2 minutes, man.
He didn't like authority. He wasn't going to have anybody in authority over him.
Eddie Jr. cuts Eric some slack. He knows his cousin's quirks are out of his hands.
Gotta relax, okay?
He has what's called Tourette's syndrome.
Eric had Tourette's. He didn't have a huge case of it. He had a small case. He was living at the Byram home because he had actually been kicked out of his.
Under Junior's patient guidance, cousin Eric is finally getting his act together. Everyone seems to be doing great. But what lies beyond the looking glass is more depraved than anyone in Little Iuka ever imagined. Since cousin Eric moved in, he and Junior Byram have become thick as thieves.
Growing up together, they just go be almost like brothers.
They did basically the same things. They liked music, they liked making music, so they got along pretty well.
Edward Sr. has been monitoring the boys' relationship. And even as he shoots home movies, he worries Wild Eric holds a bit too much sway over impressionable Junior.
Eric and Edward Jr., I think, were close because Edward didn't make him feel different. He made him feel like a normal person.
What are you doing, man? Come on.
The boys' band may be taking off. But Dad wants Junior to focus on what's truly important, like his studies.
All right, Dad, you made my face for that. Come on.
With Edward Jr., music occupied a great deal of his time. He had a lot more emphasis on music than he did in going to school, being a student.
Junior promises to hit the books. Before long, the boys' obsession with music will tear their family apart. It's a beautiful spring day. And things couldn't be going better for the Byrams. Michelle has prepared a sumptuous meal for her 3 fellas. What better time for Junior to make a big announcement?
Have a little toast myself.
Yeah. You guys know that school is...
The shocking news? Junior's dropping out of high school for the love of rock and roll.
Edward Jr. was good enough to play in a bar just across the state line and get paid.
You are out of your freaking mind?
His father was not pleased with it.
Edward Sr. was not the type of man that quit anything.
He's furious at his son. But the rest of the family doesn't escape Edward's rage.
You don't get to talk to me about like that. You don't want to know that. You can talk to me like that. Gotcha.
Tempers are running so hot, the family nearly comes to blows. Junior's first instinct is to run to Mommy. But there's only so much Michelle can do when her husband's this unhinged. All this stress and strife seems to be taking a toll on Mother's health.
Michelle had many chronic illnesses. Clearly, she was ill.
She seems sick all the time.
And her symptoms are getting inexplicably worse.
I found it strange that she would be all dressed up, ready to go, drive around town. And then the next day, she would go like dyingly ill. She could go from one extreme to another.
The Byrams had built a wonderful life together. But now it's starting to crumble. As Father Edward, Mother Michelle, son Junior, and cousin Eric struggle to stay healthy in a very sick house. Coming up, there are explosive secrets in this family, and all it takes is one wild night to light the fuse. After dropping out of high school, 18-year-old Junior Byram is living the dream. He sleeps all day and rock and rolls all night, playing at the local roadhouse.
Edward Jr. was a great musician. All the other girls were chasing after him, so I was going to chase after him too.
Just because it's last call doesn't mean the fun has to end.
Friday nights, everybody would go to the Byram party house.
Clearly, there was a lot of drinking. A lot of social behavior that was a little over the top.
The parties could get kind of crazy. Honestly, that house was the first place I ever tried a few things. It was just party all the time.
Junior's buttoned-down parents would surely find these shindigs unseemly if they were home. Just so happens, the couple has their own Friday night routine.
Edward Sr. and Michelle, they would go to hotels and spend the night on weekends.
With their home overrun by groupies, who can blame them?
The only time that Edward and Michelle had a chance to be together, they had to leave the house. I don't know what they did, but that was their only escape, to be alone.
These two steamy spouses look like the picture of marital bliss. Back at the Byram family home, partygoers can't help but wonder about Edward and Michelle's wild love life. Who wouldn't try to sneak a peek into the couple's secret world? Junior keeps his friends from snooping, but even he's grown curious about his father's mysterious room.
It was sort of a cave in its pure sense. That was his secret place to do whatever he wanted to do.
Who could have known? Edward Sr.'s lurid little secret would soon be front-page news. On Saturday morning, Edward Sr. and Michelle arrive home from their latest staycation and find the family home looking more like a brothel. For Dad, it's the last straw.
When Edward Sr. came home, he just didn't want to deal with a bunch of kids.
Some people want peace and comfort, not a bunch of hooligans like we was just coming around and hanging out.
The parties became out of control enough that Edward Byram Sr. did try to stop them.
Get out of here!
To Michelle's horror, her husband unleashes on Junior. He scolds his wife for being an enabler.
Why do you do that? You enable him all the time. You get his friends over here like this?
And Edward Sr. can't help but notice that since Cousin Eric moved in, the family's problems seem to be escalating.
Edward Sr. could get violent with the baseball bat, waving it around.
Eric's finally had enough. He decides to pack his bags and move out. But if Edward thinks an iron fist will fix everything, he's sorely mistaken. Two days after Cousin Eric leaves, Mother Michelle is stricken with the most agonizing pain of her life.
Michelle, Friday morning, had got her husband, Edward Sr., to take her to the hospital because she was feeling sick. She was admitted that morning, supposed to have double pneumonia.
The ER doctor informs Edward his wife won't be released for several days, at least. So he goes home to rest. And Junior keeps Michelle company at the hospital. That afternoon, the teen returns home. Right away, he knows something is amiss. The door to his father's man cave is ajar.
The room's very dark.
Edward Jr. discovered his father's body at the house.
The young man rushes outside and calls 911. Deputies and detectives from the tiny Tishomingo County Sheriff's Office race to the scene and discover this family is as twisted as they get.
On a videotape, there is a picture of Michelle in a sex act.
Coming up, investigators wade knee-deep into a wellspring of sexual secrets. And what they see, they'll never be able to unsee. Tishomingo County detectives arrive at the Byram family home after Eddie Jr. found his dad dead. The young man is waiting for them in the driveway.
Edward Jr. was standing outside the house, leaned up against his car with his arms folded.
He's practically catatonic.
I don't think he was very emotional at the time. He was not crying or hysterical.
Edward Jr. was very calm. He was staring at the ground a lot.
Leaving Junior in the driveway with a deputy, investigators enter the home and set their sights on the murdered man's secret lair.
The room was really the furthest Edward Sr. could get from where everybody else hung out in the house.
And what a room it is. Clearly more dungeon than den.
He put carpet up on the walls, he put black plastic up on the windows, one TV, a couple of VCRs.
Edward's body lies trapped between the couch and the coffee table, wearing nothing but a pair of boxer shorts.
He's got 2 bullet holes to the chest.
There was 2 exit wounds. One went all the way through the couch into the wall behind the sofa.
A bullet has grazed his thumb. And just a few feet away, a shattered TV remote.
We think that he was probably asleep with the remote control on his chest.
One shell struck his hand, and remote control that was on his chest while he was asleep and entered his torso from there.
Now to figure out who fired the bullets and why.
We started processing all the evidence that we could find at the crime scene, documenting where evidence is found. We found aluminum hull, CCI 9mm shell casings. We found some holes in the wall behind the sofa, so we knew the trajectory of the missiles.
We determined that there had been 4 shots fired and only 2 of them actually hit him.
Edward Sr.'s pants, folded neatly on the sofa arm, contain another intriguing clue.
We found Edward Byram's pants that he'd just taken off prior to laying down. His billfold was in the pocket, and it had cash inside the billfold.
Seems pretty clear. Money wasn't the motive.
If there was money missing, wallet missing, that sort of thing, then it lends itself more towards maybe a random killing. You know, did he surprise a burglar or something like that? There were no indications that he surprised anybody. If anything, he was surprised.
We knew that something else had happened. We knew we had an individual that came here just to kill Edward Byram Sr.
Could it have something to do with his little hobby?
There were blank videotapes with no covers on them. From what I could tell, watching the video myself, they were quite scandalous.
The tape portrays the dead man's wife in some very compromising positions.
On a videotape, there is a picture of Michelle Byram in a sex act.
Suddenly, the carpeted walls and blacked out windows make perfect sense. This room wasn't Edward's man cave. It was his personal porno studio, where he filmed other men having sex with his wife.
What today we would call a man cave, it seems a little kinky at this point.
Murder victim Edward Byram was deep into a filthy world of amateur porn. The question now, was wife Michelle his willing partner or his unwilling victim? Exiting the Byram home, a deputy finds son Junior waiting patiently on the front lawn. The anxious young man seems desperate for answers.
He asked one of our deputies at the scene, did my father have a heart attack?
A curious question among so many, in a family that's not what it appears to be. His only son is detained for questioning. Meantime, another detective heads to the hospital to question the dead man's bedridden wife.
We was told that she had double pneumonia.
She had had some pulmonary problems. She had had a lot of other minor to serious health problems. And so the fact that she would need to be hospitalized really wasn't unusual.
Michelle could not have pulled the trigger, but investigators can't yet exclude the possibility of a hired gun. Police need to know more about the saucy home movies recovered from the murder scene. In an emotional confession, Michelle admits she's been a sexual victim all her life.
Michelle Byram made comments that Edward had a sex problem, that he was a sex addict, and he wanted her to do different things.
First, the aspiring movie maker filmed their intimate moments. Then, Edward built a private sex den, complete with props.
There was some equipment that she alleged that her husband used to produce pornography.
Before long, Edward was inviting buddies over to have a go at his wife.
There were a few sexual things mentioned that he would make her do.
Edward forced her, allegedly, into performing sexual acts for him to videotape.
To Michelle's great shame, she went along with all of it. Shocking revelations indeed, but Michelle's got an even bigger bombshell to drop. She isn't plagued with some mysterious immune system problem. Her double pneumonia's been brought on by something much more wicked.
She had made that statement that she had injected rat poison to herself.
She took rat poison to make herself sick.
Frequent hospital stays being her only respite from a truly horrific home life.
Her health situation was brought on by herself. If it was to gain sympathy from her husband or her son, she thought she should be sick all the time.
The buildup of arsenic in Michelle's system has had a disastrous effect. She's taken her body to the very edge of toxic overdose. The question now, if this Munchausen mom was crazy enough to poison herself, might she have been desperate enough to kill? Detectives ask Michelle if the family owns any firearms.
Michelle started telling us about that there was a gun at their house.
The weapon belonged to Edward Sr.'s father and was a World War II Luger-type pistol. Pistol was unreal. Antique weapon. It was in pristine condition.
Curiously, investigators found no such weapon during their crime scene search. Back at headquarters, detectives ask Junior if life in the Byram household was really the horror show his mom described.
The story Edward gave us was he had no idea what happened.
But clearly, Junior had some issues with dear old Dad.
Edward Jr. was close to his mother, and they both endured some physical altercations with Edward Sr. They had a history of fighting, of brawling. You can imagine that it went on in the house, it rolled out in the yard, it was all over the place.
Investigators have to wonder, could Junior Byram have killed his dad to protect his mom? They lay a trap to find out.
We asked Edward Jr. if there were any firearms in the house, if anybody owned a pistol.
And he said there are no guns. We never had any guns in the house.
Mother Michelle already told investigators the family owned an antique pistol. Is Junior clueless or lying? Finally, detectives asked Junior about the fourth member of the Byram household, Cousin Eric.
Junior told us Eric Byram was living at the house up until just before the time the murder happened. The day of the murder, he was moving out because he was moving in with a friend. He had came to the residence to get some more of his clothes.
Junior's cousin visited the scene of the crime just hours before the shooting. Now, as Eric unpacks in his new apartment, he gets an unexpected visit.
Who is that? Detectives. Are you Eric?
They simply want to verify the young man's whereabouts at the time of the murder, but instead find themselves toe-to-toe with one angry hombre.
I don't see a warrant on this, you guys. Get out of my place.
He was very irate, very loud, using a lot of curse words to the officers.
The Byram Black Sheep is belligerent. Guess he likes doing things the hard way.
I was at the jail when they brought Eric in, and he didn't want to talk to us.
He couldn't believe he was even there. He didn't have any reason why he was there.
He did not know anything that went on, nothing about it. He didn't even know it until the sheriff told him that his uncle was dead.
Eric unleashes a torrent of obscenities at the shocked detectives.
We kept thinking he was somehow involved. It wasn't adding up what he was saying.
By now, investigators have quite a family of suspects. Did Cousin Eric get back at Uncle Ed for giving him the boot? Had sex slave Michelle finally reached her breaking point? Or did son Junior kill to protect Mom from Dad's abuse?
We're not used to having families kill each other in Tishomingo County or Iuka, Mississippi.
Up next, the strangest investigation in this little town's history has a twist ending worthy of a Hollywood thriller. According to murder victim Edward Byram's family, the deceased was a crazed sex addict who abused his wife, roughed up his son, and berated his own nephew. So which of the dead man's loved ones finally took revenge? Detectives know much is rotten inside the Byram family. So they start at the beginning and review their case evidence. First up, Junior Byram's 911 call.
When he called the 911 operator, he said, "My father has been shot."
But half an hour after that emergency call, when a deputy spoke with Junior at the murder scene, he'd asked if his father had a heart attack.
We knew something was wrong by his story.
Sensing blood in the water, detectives drag rowdy cousin Eric Byram out of his holding cell for a second shot at questioning. After hours spent behind bars, they hope his explosive temper has finally petered out.
The first time I met Eric, he was just overly excited and didn't want to be where he was at. Tourette's syndrome causes people to, when more pressure is put on them, it'll show up worse. It doesn't always have to be a curse word. It's portrayed on TV. It's just an outburst.
Now cooled off and cooperative, Eric admits that Junior told him something very strange on the morning of the murder.
Eric Byram had came to the residence to get some more of his clothes because he was moving in with a friend.
That's when Junior let his cousin in on a secret.
Edward tells Eric, you might not want to be here today. Today's the day we're going to do it.
Eric figured, likely story.
He blows this off as just Edward telling some more of his crap. He didn't believe anything he said.
Time for another chat with Junior. Confronted with his cousin's revelation, Eddie Jr. starts to bend to the pressure.
And after we approached him with what we already knew, Edward felt like he had to tell the truth. He didn't have anywhere else to go.
Junior admits he'd grown enraged at his brutish father, but swears he was a mere pawn in the twisted plot.
Edward Jr. said Michelle Byram was the mastermind, per se, behind this whole event. Edward Jr.'s involvement in his father's death, he told us, was at his mother's request.
According to Junior, Mother Michelle was tired of being a victim and was devising a plan to end her life as a sex slave. Finally pushed to the limit, the battered woman prepares to strike back.
Byram Jr. told us how his mother wanted her husband, his father, dead, out of the way.
According to Junior, Michelle wanted to hire one of Junior's friends to do the job. She even had a boy in mind, Joey Gillis, the bassist in Junior's band.
Joey Gillis is a friend of Edward Jr. that was at the house quite a bit.
Get out of here!
Michelle Byram actually contacted Joey Gillis to kill her husband. She was going to pay Joey Gillis insurance money.
Edward Sr. had a $150,000 life insurance policy.
Junior tells detectives that within days, the plan was afoot. Junior claims Joey Gillis was given the family's antique Luger pistol and 2 clips of ammunition. Michelle injected rat poison in order to make herself sick, knowing a hospital stay would be the perfect alibi.
Edward, at some point, he took Michelle to the hospital, was there for a period of time with her, and then went back to the house.
Prompting Junior to tell Joey it was time. Junior says the teenage hitman entered the Byram home through an unlocked back door. and silently crept into the Byram home's man cave, where Edward Sr. lay sleeping. Gillis dashed outside where Junior was waiting in the getaway car.
They threw the shirt and the glove into the woods on the side of the road. And they hid the pistol behind a tree.
Junior then drove straight to the hospital.
He went and informed his mother that her husband was dead.
Michelle had said it would be best if you found him. And then that is why Junior went back to the house.
That's when he called 911. Said his dad had been shot.
And then he asked, did my father have a heart attack? Putting all these things together, we knew he obviously knew more than he was telling us.
Investigators descend on Michelle Byram's hospital room and place the scheming spouse under arrest. Cousin Eric Byram is cleared of all charges and released. Joey Gillis is arrested. Though Gillis claims he didn't pull the trigger, he does plead guilty to conspiracy and is sentenced to 15 years. Junior Byram cuts a similar deal. He is sentenced to 30 years. In November 2000, Michelle Byram is found guilty and sentenced to death. In the spring 2014, the Mississippi Supreme Court grants her a new trial. That case is still pending. After more than a decade behind bars, Junior Byram earned himself an early release from prison. Though it's difficult for him to reflect on his crime, he now concedes his mother exploited him.
It took a few years for me to actually own up to the fact that, here's, Superwoman in my view. But then looking back on it from the sober perspective and having all the facts and all the evidence there, is, she was manipulating me.
Today, the Byram family's tragic tale is common lore in Little Iuka, Mississippi.
Small town USA, the name Byram's gonna mean one thing, and that's just something I'm gonna have to live with. One decision can mess everything up. My views of my father have changed greatly since being locked up. I look back now and I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he loved me.
As for the Byram...
On the afternoon of July 18, 1984, the heat in San Isidro lay over the neighborhood like a sheet of metal left long in the sun. The light was hard, almost white, pressing down on parking lots, windshields or roofs, and the painted signs of ordinary businesses going about an ordinary weekday. Cars rolled in and out of driveways. Children fidgeted in back seats. Workers crossed streets with the tired rhythm of people moving through another summer day at the edge of the border, where English and Spanish mingled in the air as naturally as the smell of gasoline, frying food, and dust. There was nothing in the sky, nothing in the slow turn of traffic, nothing in the faces passing by that warned of what was about to be torn open. The McDonald's on San Isidro Boulevard looked like what it was meant to be, a bright, familiar place built to promise speed, routine, and the small comfort of predictable hunger answered quickly. Families came because it was easy, children came because it felt cheerful, teenagers came because it was a meeting point, workers came because the day was long and the food was cheap and close. The building sat in the American afternoon as harmlessly as a paper cup on a tray, and then, in a matter of moments, it would become something else entirely, a place forever split into one version existing before the violence and one after, with no road back from the second to the first. That is one of the most frightening truths about certain crimes. They do not merely take lives, they alter the identity of places. They stain the ordinary until even memory cannot wash it clean. Before the first shot, the restaurant was part of the landscape. Afterward, it would become a wound people could point to on a map. The man who arrived there that day did not come in confusion, in panic, or in a momentary burst of blind rage. He came carrying weapons, carrying intent, carrying a private collapse that he had chosen to turn outward. He entered not as a customer, not as a father, not as a troubled man seeking help, but as a force determined to break bodies and routines at random, to drag terror into the center of lunch hour and make strangers die under fluorescent light. The cruelty of such an act is not only in the number of victims, it is in the setting. A battlefield is expected to hold danger. A dark alley carries a warning in its shadows. But a fast food restaurant in the middle of the day is built around trust. Parents trusted enough to bring children. Employees trusted enough to spend long shifts behind the counter. Elderly customers trusted enough to sit by the window with coffee. That trust is part of the architecture, invisible but essential. On that day, it was shattered with a brutality that still feels difficult to grasp decades later. To understand the horror of San Isidro, it helps to look first at the stillness that existed before the storm. This was a working community, close to the U.S.-Mexico border, shaped by movement, labor, family ties, and cultural overlap. The restaurant was not an abstract target. It stood inside the daily life of a neighborhood. People who entered it carried errands, jokes, fatigue, plans for dinner, reminders about bills, worries about school, thoughts about work the next morning. Some were simply passing through. Some were regulars. Some were children too young to understand danger beyond scraped knees and stern voices. There is a special kind of heartbreak in crimes like this because the victims are caught while living so plainly, so innocently inside the mechanics of a normal day. No one walks into a restaurant at midday expecting history to find them there in the form of gunfire. No one expects the place where a child asks for fries to become the place where mothers throw themselves over sons, where employees crouch in terror behind counters they had wiped clean an hour earlier, where blood spreads under plastic chairs and tables designed for quick meals and quick departures. Yet that is exactly what happened. The attack would leave 21 people dead and many others wounded, but numbers, though necessary, flatten what human beings actually suffer. A death toll is a cold instrument. It cannot show the unfinished motion of a hand reaching for food. It cannot show a child's confusion as noise becomes catastrophe. It cannot show the stunned silence that sometimes follows impossible violence, when survivors cannot yet form language around what they have seen. Behind every count stood a person whose day had begun with no understanding that it would end beneath sirens and headlines. Some of the victims were children, some were parents. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong hour, a phrase so common it risks sounding empty until one stops and imagines what it really means. It means a person chose lunch over one restaurant and not another. It means someone delayed a trip home by 10 minutes. It means a family stopped because the children were hungry. It means the line between life and death was drawn not by guilt or innocence, not by purpose or destiny, but by pure accident and the decision of one armed man to turn human beings into targets. The event has often been described as one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history up to that point, and that is true, but the label mass shooting can also create distance. It places the event inside a category, and categories can dull the mind. They become shelves on which society stores its horrors. The San Isidro Massacre was not just an early entry in a grim national pattern. It was a human disaster made of individual moments of fear, courage, bewilderment, and irreversible loss. People did not experience it as a statistic. They experienced it as a sound, first, then as shattered glass, then as running, then as bodies dropping. Then, as the awful realization that there was nowhere safe to hide, not behind the tables, not beneath the booths, not in the restrooms, not in the arms of a parent who could not stop bullets with love, though some tried exactly that, there were acts of protection that day that still ache to imagine. Adults attempted to shield children with their own bodies. Employees and customers tried to crawl, to hide, to make themselves small against the floor. Survival became physical and animal in an instant. The room that had been organized for comfort and speed was reorganized by terror, every chair leg and divider and countertop becoming either a possible barrier or a trap. The fluorescent brightness of the restaurant, meant to create a sense of cleanliness and ease, would have made the scene feel even more exposed. There is little mercy in bright light during violence. It lets everything be seen. It reveals fear on every face. It turns panic into something naked. Outside, the Southern California day remained pitilessly ordinary. Traffic moved. The sun stayed fixed. Somewhere nearby, people who had not yet heard the news continued living inside the assumption that this was just another afternoon. That contrast is always hard to bear in the aftermath of public slaughter. The world does not pause when innocence is being destroyed in one of its corners. Somewhere a radio played music. Somewhere someone laughed. Somewhere a neighbor watered a patch of grass. Meanwhile, inside the McDonald's, the ordinary had collapsed into the unspeakable. The man at the center of the massacre did not choose a place associated with danger. He chose a place associated with childhood. That decision is part of what keeps the event lodged in American memory. There is a difference between violence that emerges from conflict and violence that invades innocence. This was the latter. It stepped through the doors of a restaurant decorated to welcome families and turned that welcome into vulnerability. The children who were there had not entered a contested space. They had entered one of the most recognizable symbols of routine American life. The parents who brought them could not have imagined that by doing something as ordinary as buying lunch, they were placing them in the path of a man who had decided to make strangers pay for whatever bitterness, grievance, alienation, and inward decay had taken root in him. That inward decay matters, but only in a careful sense. The hook in this story is not the killer's darkness as mythology. It is the unbearable mismatch between his decision and the innocence of the people around him. Too often, acts like this are retold in a way that grants the perpetrator a kind of monstrous centrality, as though his rage were the main story and everyone else merely the scenery against which it erupted. That is not the truth of San Isidro. The truth is that the center of this event belongs to the people whose lives were interrupted forever, to the families who later received impossible phone calls, to the children who never grew up, to the survivors who carried invisible debris in their minds long after the physical scene had been cleared. The hook is not simply that a man killed 21 people in a McDonald's. The hook is that he shattered dozens of family histories at once. He created empty seats at dinner tables. He turned birthdays into memorial dates. He transformed parents into mourners, siblings into keepers of grief, children into names recited in the past tense. And because the attack happened in public, because it unfolded in a restaurant known across the country, the grief did not remain private. It spread outward, becoming national horror, then political debate, then historical record. But before it became any of those things, it was intimate. It was one mother not coming home, one child not getting older, one employee leaving for work and never returning, one survivor waking years later to a sound that was not gunfire at all, yet feeling the body react as though it were. The first part of this story must therefore begin not with investigation or motive or the long shadow of public memory, but with atmosphere, because atmosphere is what violence destroys first. A place has a rhythm before tragedy. It has smells, textures, habits. At San Isidro that day, the smell would have been salt from fries, sweetness from soda syrup, grease from the grill, disinfectant from floors recently cleaned. There would have been paper wrappers opening, trays sliding, children asking for ketchup, an employee calling out an order, the cash register voice of commerce, the hum of air conditioning trying to fight the heat. Those details matter because atrocity does not descend into a void. It descends into life already in progress. The massacre did not create a scene from nothing. It invaded one. And once invaded, every harmless detail became unbearable in retrospect. The tray left on a table, the half-finished drink, the small shoe under a chair, the toy, the napkin, the spilled ice. In the aftermath of crimes like this, objects become witnesses. They remain after the bodies have been removed, speaking mutely of interruption. That is perhaps why certain crime scenes remain so haunting in public memory, not because they are mysterious, but because they preserve the shape of normal life at the exact instant it was torn apart. San Isidro was one of those places. It forced the country to look at a truth that would return again and again in later years, with schools, stores, churches, offices, theaters, and restaurants. That the spaces people trust most deeply can become stages for indiscriminate death when a single person decides to wage war on strangers. But in 1984, this event landed with a particular force. It was not yet one more massacre in a long American sequence. It was a rupture. It felt like a threshold had been crossed. The scale of the killing, the visibility of the setting, and the presence of children gave the crime a terrible clarity. No complicated web of secrets needed to be untangled in order to understand the moral reality of what had happened. An armed man walked into a restaurant filled with ordinary people and slaughtered them. That simplicity is part of the horror. There was no hidden conspiracy behind the victim's suffering, no personal feud that might explain why these people, no puzzle in which guilt and innocence had become blurred. There were only innocence and a man who chose to annihilate them. As this story unfolds, the names, the sequence, the official response, and the eventual end of the gunman will all matter. But the beginning must stay here for a moment longer. In the heat of that California afternoon, in the false safety of a familiar restaurant, in the final minutes before terror entered through the door. Because once it did, the world inside that building changed forever. Lunch became massacre, routine became history, and a place built for families became one of the darkest crime scenes the United States had ever known. San Isidro in the summer of 1984 was a place of crossings, not only of borders but of moods, languages, classes, expectations, and daily urgencies. It sat at the southern edge of California, near the line that separated the United States from Mexico. Yet in truth the life of the community did not move as neatly as any line on a map. Families, workers, shoppers, children, commuters, and retirees flowed through it with the practical rhythm of people who understood that life near a border was made of constant movement. The streets carried a particular texture, one created by proximity. Cars with different license plates rolled through gas stations and parking lots. Storefronts spoke in more than one language. The air could shift, sometimes carrying the warm scent of pavement and engines, sometimes the smell of grilled food and detergent from laundromats, sometimes the faint salt of distance and highway dust. It was not a glamorous place, and it was not trying to be. It was a working community, a place where people measured days not by dramatic events, but by shifts, school pickups, grocery runs, rent, family obligations, and the quiet mathematics of getting through the week. The neighborhoods surrounding San Isidro Boulevard were made of these repeated efforts. Homes stood close enough for lives to brush against each other. Fences divided yards, but not voices. Children could be heard outside in the late afternoon. Radios drifted from open windows. Dogs barked at passing strangers. People waved across driveways. It was the kind of place where someone could still be ordinary in full view of everyone else, where daily existence did not need performance, and that ordinary quality matters, because the massacre, that would one day define the place in the national imagination happened not in a vacuum, not in a symbolic arena chosen for grand spectacle, but in the middle of a living community that had its own habits, fatigue, and dignity long before outsiders learned its name through headlines. In 1984 America, the country was moving through a period of loud surfaces and deep fractures. The decade often gets remembered through the shine of television images, campaign slogans, expanding consumer culture, and the bright confidence of advertisements that promised upward motion. Yet beneath that polished skin were harder truths: economic strain in working communities, growing social alienation, and treated mental collapse hidden inside homes, and a widening cultural habit of confusing visibility with understanding. Many people were working longer than they wanted for less security than they needed. Some neighborhoods felt overlooked unless tragedy forced them onto the evening news. In places like San Isidro, those national conditions could be felt in subtle ways. The people who lived there often carried the pressure of being geographically central to trade and transit while remaining culturally peripheral to the people who shaped broader narratives about California. This was not the postcard California of beaches, studio lights, and effortless abundance. This was border California, full of motion and labor, where life was often practical, sometimes precarious, and always close to the realities of money, immigration, policing, family strain, and survival. To understand the emotional landscape of the massacre, it is necessary to understand the setting into which it erupted. The McDonald's restaurant itself was part of a growing American architecture of familiarity. By the 1980s, the fast food chain had become more than a place to buy a meal. It had become a symbol of routine, convenience, and a carefully manufactured sense of comfort. The bright colors, the standardized menu, the cheerful branding, the promise that one location would feel much like another no matter where you were. All of it was designed to make customers lower their guard. Parents trusted it because it felt clean, simple, and child-friendly. Children loved it because it looked happy before it even smelled good. Teenagers used it as a social waypoint. Workers used it as a quick solution in the middle of tired days. In communities like San Isidro, a McDonald's was not glamorous, but it was woven into ordinary life. It was a place where someone could take a child after errands, where a family could stretch a few dollars into a meal that felt like a treat, where employees, many of them young, learned the rhythms of work, customer service, and time management beneath fluorescent lights and beneath managers' clipped instructions. The San Isidro McDonald's did not stand apart from the community. It belonged to its daily machinery. That was part of what made the later violence so devastating. When people imagine crimes of extraordinary brutality, they often picture isolated places, dark roads, abandoned buildings, or morally charged environments where danger appears almost expected. But this restaurant stood in the open. It was visible. It was brightly branded. It existed within routine. Its danger, before that day, would have seemed almost unthinkable to the people who entered it. The workers who showed up for their shifts did not cross a threshold into menace. They crossed into repetition. They tied aprons, washed hands, checked the registers, prepped food, moved through procedures learned through habit. The customers who parked outside were not taking a risk they could name. They were doing what millions of Americans did without a second thought. They were choosing speed, familiarity, and convenience in the middle of summer. The innocence of that choice is part of the story's context. It is what gives the later violence its sickening contrast. San Isidro itself carried a cultural intimacy that many communities near national borders understand instinctively. Families were often multi-generational. Spanish might be spoken in one room, English in the next, both languages mixed at the dinner table without ceremony. There was no need to explain that identity could be layered, that belonging could stretch across a line on a map while daily obligations remained grounded in the here and now. In such communities, Restaurants and public spaces often hold more than commercial value. They become casual meeting points, visible anchors in the flow of the day. People say they will meet near this store, stop by that restaurant, bring the children there after an appointment, grab coffee there before heading back. A place like McDonald's becomes part landmark, part pause, part reward, part convenience. This was especially true in a warm weather place where movement between errands was constant and where public space still held social energy. On a hot July day, a restaurant with air conditioning and inexpensive food could feel almost like a small refuge. The borderland atmosphere added another layer. San Isidro was a place where the movement of people was constant enough that it became background noise. Cars lined up, streets stayed busy, and commerce never fully slept. Yet with that movement came a kind of anonymity that can exist even inside close communities. People knew one another in fragments. A face seen at a store, a family recognized from church, the teenager known from school, an employee whose name customers never learned but whose smile became familiar. This network of partial familiarity gives working neighborhoods their emotional character. It means that when violence strikes, the damage radiates outward quickly because even strangers were never entirely strangers. One victim might be a cousin's classmate, another a neighbor's child, another someone recognized by sight from previous visits. A massacre in such a setting does not remain confined to the immediate victims. It ripples through social tissue already connected in quiet ways. In 1984, mass public killings on this scale had not yet become a routine feature of American consciousness. That does not mean the country was innocent of violence. Far from it. The United States had known assassinations, serial murders, domestic slaughter, racial terror, and public bloodshed long before San Isidro. But the specific horror of a heavily armed man walking into a crowded fast food restaurant and murdering strangers, including children, in broad daylight struck with a force that many people were still unprepared to process. There was not yet the same exhausted vocabulary that would later surround such events. The public had fewer rehearsed reactions, fewer familiar scripts, fewer cultural calluses. The shock landed more rawly. The nation had seen evil before, but this kind of spectacular destruction of the everyday felt like a warning from the future, one that many did not yet know how to hear. That broader national context matters because it shaped how the event would be perceived. It was not simply a local crime with local consequences. It felt, even then, like a violation of something larger. The idea that ordinary public life, however flawed the country might be, still contained zones of assumed safety. The attack would help erode that assumption. Yet inside San Isidro, before any national meaning was imposed upon it, life kept moving according to simpler concerns. People were thinking about work, food, children, errands, weather, bills. Some were likely tired from heat and routine. Summer has its own atmosphere in communities like this. The light can feel relentless, afternoons stretched and drowsy, tempers shorter, sidewalks brighter, interiors more precious for their shade. Children out of school moved differently through the day than they would in autumn. Families sought affordable ways to fill time. Teenagers gathered in public places because home could feel too small or too hot. Restaurants became temporary stations in a moving day. The San Isidro McDonald's would have reflected all of that. Its parking lot, its driveways, its windows, its booths, its counters were not abstract features. They were parts of a lived environment shaped by heat, routine, appetite, and the quiet need people have for predictable places. The killer's own life, though not yet the center of this section, also formed part of the context in a grimly different way. Violence on this scale does not emerge out of nowhere, even when it seems to explode without warning for those caught in its path. Somewhere before the act itself were accumulating fractures, private grievances, distortions of thought, resentments turned inward until they sought release outward. The important point is not to grant those fractures dignity or mystery. It is to recognize that the massacre was not the product of a single moment detached from history. It came from a human being who had moved through the world for years, carrying failures, anger, and instability that eventually hardened into something catastrophic. The danger in revisiting perpetrators is always that explanation begins to resemble excuse. That must not happen here. Still, context requires acknowledging that monstrous acts are committed by people who once appeared ordinary enough to live among others, to work, to marry, to complain, to age, to drift. One of the bitterest truths about mass violence is that it often emerges not from legends of evil but from human deterioration left to rot in plain sight or just beyond the edge of communal attention. Yet the moral center remains with those who were living ordinary lives in San Isidro, unaware that someone else's collapse was moving toward them. The community itself was no stranger to hardship. Border regions often absorb tensions that larger political conversations reduce to abstractions. Economic uncertainty, mobility, questions of belonging, patterns of law enforcement, and the strain of family life under pressure all form part of the background atmosphere. But hardship does not produce massacre. Most people who endure strain do not turn their suffering into annihilation. Most communities carrying burdens do not erupt in slaughter. That is why the San Isidro story must keep two truths in view at once. The setting was real, layered, and vulnerable, and the act that would occur within it was still a choice, not an inevitability. The neighborhood did not summon its own tragedy. A man brought it there. The physical design of the restaurant also shaped the context in ways that would later matter terribly. Fast food spaces are built for visibility, flow, and efficiency. Large front windows invite light and advertise safety. Counter space is open so customers can order quickly. Seating areas are arranged for brief comfort rather than refuge. Kitchens are functional, not fortified. Entrances welcome movement. The whole design assumes cooperation. It assumes that the customer enters hungry, impatient perhaps, distracted perhaps, but fundamentally peaceful. It assumes workers will be busy, children noisy, trays temporary, messes manageable. Nothing in the architecture prepares for siege. Once violence enters such a place, every design choice becomes cruelly inverted. Windows become exposure. Open floor plans become vulnerability. Booths become flimsy cover. Narrow work areas become traps. The very features meant to create convenience begin to serve terror. That was part of the unthinkable nature of what happened in San Isidro. The building was never meant to absorb malice on that scale, nor were the people inside prepared, psychologically or physically, to interpret the first sounds as the beginning of a massacre. In crime stories built around secrecy, context often revolves around hidden motives and concealed relationships. Here, the context is more haunting because it is so public and so exposed. There was no locked room, no private feud unfolding behind curtains, no mansion of grudges waiting to be untangled. There was a neighborhood restaurant on a summer day in a working border community. There were families, employees, and children doing ordinary things. That is the stage on which the horror would arrive. And because the setting was so plain, the event would imprint itself more deeply. People could imagine themselves there too easily. They could imagine taking their own child to such a place, standing in line, carrying a tray, wiping ketchup from a small hand, sitting by a window waiting for fries. The scene was legible to nearly everyone. That universality widened the emotional wand. It also helped transform the massacre into a national symbol of vulnerability. But before it became symbol, it was local reality. It belonged first to San Isidro and to the people whose lives intersected with that restaurant on July 18, 1984. The sun that day did not rise over a city preparing for history. It rose over families making breakfast, workers dressing for shifts, children moving through summer hours, traffic building in familiar patterns. The restaurant itself opened as it always did, with no omen stamped across its windows. The counters were stocked, the fryers hot, the floor likely cleaned. the signs bright and ordinary. Outside, the day was just another California day, harsh with light, heavy with heat, almost indifferent in its calm. That indifference is part of the atmosphere of every catastrophe. Nature offers no signal, no moral warning. The sky stays blue while lives move toward disaster. The parking lot holds sunlight with perfect neutrality. Shadows sit under cars. Somewhere nearby, someone thinks about nothing more serious than lunch. Then, without permission, one life's private ruin collides with a public space full of strangers. That is the threshold part to must bring us to the full shape of the world before it is broken. San Isidro was not merely the backdrop to atrocity. It was a living place, dense with effort and habit, layered with borderland identity, economically modest, culturally rich, and built on the fragile trust that ordinary public spaces will remain ordinary. The McDonald's was part of that trust, part of the architecture of daily life. The country around it was entering an era that did not yet understand how often such trust would later be betrayed. And the people moving through that hot afternoon did so with the unguarded gestures of those who still believed, for a few final minutes, that the familiar world would keep its shape. What remains after an event like San Isidro is not only the police timeline, not only the photographs, not only the number that history repeats with a flattening chill. What remains most stubbornly is the human voice, even when that voice was never formally recorded, even when it survives only in fragments carried by witnesses, relatives, doctors, and the unfinished gestures of the dead. A victim's statement, in a case like this, cannot be a single testimony delivered neatly across a table. It must be assembled from the lives interrupted inside that McDonald's on July 18, 1984, from the ordinary hopes those people carried through the door, from the terror forced upon them, and from the silence that followed. It is the statement of a child who wanted lunch, of a mother whose body turned into shelter, of a worker who came in expecting grease, cheddar, and a long shift rather than blood and gunfire. It is the statement of a community that did not offer itself for martyrdom, and yet was made to bear it. To tell this part honestly is to remember that the victims were not background to a killer's rage. They were the center of the world until he entered it. Each one possessed a private life too large to fit inside a headline, a private rhythm of affection, worry, memory, and expectation. Some of them woke that morning with errands to run and children to feed. Some were already thinking ahead to evening, to dishes, to television, to work the next day. Some were young enough that the future still existed for them as something wordless and infinite, not a plan but a sensation, a feeling that more life was simply waiting. That is the first statement the victims make, even before the attack begins. We were here living. We were not symbols. We were not a backdrop. We were not the anonymous bodies mass violence prefers. We had names, routines, families, expressions, tempers, favored foods, shoes by the door, clothes left in the wash, toys at home, plans half-spoken, birthdays still ahead. In the full cruelty of public slaughter, what is stolen first is not only breath but continuity. The victims of San Isidro were denied the next minute of lives already in motion. Some entered that restaurant carrying children on their hips or guiding them by the wrist. Some were children themselves, drawn by the bright colors and simple promise of fries, soda, relief from the heat, the small thrill of being out in the middle of the day. One can imagine the ordinary choreography before the violence. A tray lifted from the counter, a hand pushing hair back from a damp forehead, a child squirming in a seat, the hiss of fryers, and the soft slap of shoes across tile, ketchup packets tearing open, ice settling inside paper cups. The workers behind the counter moving with the practiced efficiency of people whose bodies have memorized small motions. Reach, wrap, pass, wipe, turn, smile, repeat. None of these gestures were heroic in the dramatic sense. They were simply alive. That is why they matter. A victim's statement begins there, in the ordinary dignity of repeated action. The people inside that McDonald's were not waiting to become part of history. They were spending an afternoon. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to move too quickly toward the violence, as though the victims only become real at the moment they are threatened. But they were real long before that. The mother who sat down with her children had already lived years of invisible labor and love that no reporter would ever fully recover. The elderly customer had already accumulated habits, aches, memories, and losses of his own. The employee working the shift had likely already learned what it means to endure boredom with grace, rude customers with politeness, heat with patience. The teenagers who came in for food and air conditioning carried their own unfinished selves, their own uncertain expressions of becoming. Each person in that restaurant had crossed into the building with a life trailing behind them like a long road. In the cruel arithmetic of massacre, that long road is abruptly reduced to a point, to a time of death, to a medical description, to a name on a list, but the emotional truth is much larger. So let the statement widen. Let it say, I was hungry, I was tired, I was young, I was watching my child, I was waiting for my order, I was doing my job, I was laughing a moment earlier. I was thinking about later, not knowing there would be no later. I trusted this place because it was ordinary. I did not know that a stranger had chosen us. That last truth is perhaps the deepest wound in the victim's voice. They were chosen and not chosen at once. They were not selected because of a private grievance, not because of secrets, betrayal, or personal history. They were selected because they were there, because they were available to the gunman's appetite for destruction, because chance placed them in his field of hatred. There is something especially brutal about this kind of victimhood. It strips away the comforting illusion that danger announces itself through personal conflict. These victims had done nothing to attract violence except exist in public. Their statement, then, is also an accusation against randomness weaponized by human will. It says, we were ordinary, and you turned that ordinariness into vulnerability. The children inside that McDonald's speak most painfully through absence. Children do not yet know how fragile the world is supposed to be. They trust rooms because adults guide them into those rooms. They trust restaurants because adults smile there, because the colors are bright, because the food arrives in small, cheerful containers, because the dangers they understand are minor and manageable. A spilled drink can be cleaned, a scraped knee will stop hurting, a stern voice passes, a loud noise may frighten them, but then a parent explains it away. In San Isidro, children were forced into a reality beyond explanation. In that instant, the world ceased obeying the rules adults had taught them. The place that looked safe became deadly. The grown-ups around them, who were supposed to know what to do, had only their bodies and panic. Some used those bodies as shields. That fact alone says more about victimhood than any formal testimony could. Parents, in moments of mortal chaos, tried to become walls. They bent over children, gathered them close, pressed themselves across small forms as if love could thicken into armor. The victim's statement is in that movement. It says, I could not stop the bullets, but I tried to place myself between death and someone smaller than me. That is not abstraction. That is the final physical language of devotion. There is no courtroom sentence powerful enough to equal the image of a parent covering a child in the last seconds of life. And yet such acts must be named carefully, not to aestheticize suffering but to restore moral proportion. The killer brought violence. The victims brought whatever protection, courage, instinct, and tenderness human beings can still summon in terror, employees to deserve to be heard within this part of the story. Fast food workers are so often rendered invisible in public life, seen as background to service, part of the machinery that produces convenience. Yet on that day they were among the people trapped at the center of an unthinkable attack. Young workers who had shown up for another shift suddenly found the familiar map of the restaurant transformed into a maze of danger. Counters became cover too thin to trust. The kitchen became both refuge and trap. Instructions that usually governed their day move faster, keep the line going, smile at the customer, suddenly dissolved into one command only: survive if you can. The victim's statement comes through them as well. It says, I was earning a paycheck. I was trying to get through the day. I did not know my workplace would become a killing ground. There is something unbearable in that simple truth. Work, for most people, is not sacred, but it is necessary. People give hours of their lives to routine jobs on the assumption that routine itself offers a kind of safety. When violence enters such a place, it destroys not only bodies, but the social trust upon which daily labor depends. Families of the victims carry another form of statement, one that begins after the shooting but belongs emotionally to the same moment. They are the ones who waited for loved ones who did not come home. They are the ones who answered ringing phones or stopped in confusion when news spread. They are the ones who moved toward hospitals, toward police barriers, toward rumors and lists and the unbearable limbo between hope and confirmation. In every mass killing there is a second scene, less photographed but equally shattering, the scene of recognition, a father learning that a daughter was inside. A sister scanning names with a trembling certainty she does not want, a mother searching faces in waiting rooms. Families become unwilling archivists of the victims' unfinished lives. They know what food someone liked, how someone laughed when embarrassed, what someone worried about the night before. They know how a child slept, how a teenager sulked, how a parent folded laundry, how a grandparent carried fatigue in the shoulders. When the dead cannot speak, family memory becomes their statement. And memory is never brief, it overflows every official summary. The families of San Isidro's victims did not lose abstractions. They lost exact people. That exactness matters. A massacre tries to erase individuality by piling life into numbers. Mourning reverses that erasure. Mourning insists on detail. It says this child had a particular face. This mother stood a certain way. This worker had plans. This person was loved in a specific voice by specific people. There is also the statement of the survivors, those who crawled, hid, ran, bled, or watched others die and then had to continue living after the event had passed. Survival is often mistaken for escape, as if leaving a crime scene alive means leaving it behind, but survivors carry the event forward in their bodies. The loud crack of gunfire does not remain in the past when memory stores it as a permanent alarm. A restaurant smell can change. A summer afternoon can change. The sight of a child at a fast food table can become unbearable. The victim's statement continues through survivors because the dead and living were bound together in that room. A survivor might remember the details no camera could hold: the skid of shoes on tile, the way someone reached out and then disappeared from sight. The terrible confusion in the first seconds when the mind refuses to accept what the ears have heard. Many survivors of such events describe time as breaking apart. Seconds elongate. Decisions become instinct. The body lowers itself before the mind fully understands why. The statement in those memories is not orderly, but it is human. It says, I saw ordinary life split open. I saw people become vulnerable in ways no one should. I learned too quickly how thin the distance is between lunch and slaughter. There is another dimension to the victim's statement that belongs to the community itself. San Isidro was not a wealthy enclave insulated from hardship. It was a working border community, densely human, practical, culturally mixed, and accustomed to the small negotiations of everyday life. For such a community to become nationally known through massacre carries a second violence. The place people love is suddenly described to outsiders almost exclusively through death. Yet the community's voice resists that reduction. It says, we were more than the blood on the floor. We were families, labor, faith, language, survival, routine. The victims belonged to a world rich in ties long before the gunman arrived. Remembering them means remembering that world too. A child killed in San Isidro did not emerge from nowhere into a news report. That child came from a home, from relatives, from a kitchen table. From the smell of detergent on clothes and the sound of television in the evening, and the pressure of an adult hand guiding them across a parking lot. A worker killed that day came from mornings, bills, friendships, irritation, laughter, fatigue. The victim's statement, when expanded honestly, becomes a defense of complexity against simplification. It says, "Do not let the violence have the final word about who we were." This part of the script must also acknowledge that in crimes of mass murder, the absence of a classical mystery can mislead people into thinking there is less emotional depth to uncover. There is no whodunit here. The gunman's identity was not the central enigma, but victimhood itself still demands excavation. To know who suffered, and how and why the suffering reverberates across decades, is not lesser work than solving a puzzle. In some ways it is more difficult because it requires patience rather than suspense. It requires the imagination to remain fixed not on the sensational center of violence, but on the people who had no wish to enter any story at all. The victims of San Isidro did not audition for tragedy. It was imposed upon them. Their statement therefore contains protest. It says, "You do not get to use our deaths as scenery. You do not get to admire the horror while forgetting the human cost." The restaurant itself, if one allows the setting a symbolic voice, seems to hold echoes of that statement. A McDonald's is built around cheerful noise, movement, appetite, and transience. People come and go. Meals are brief. Tables are wiped for the next customer. Nothing is meant to linger. Yet after the massacre, everything lingered. The spilled drinks, the abandoned food, the stopped movements, the hush after the shooting, the way objects suddenly seemed to testify for those who no longer could. In that sense, the space preserved a final communal statement of interruption. This plate was not meant to be left unfinished. This child was not meant to disappear here. This shift was not meant to end like this. The most devastating aspect of victimhood in San Isidro is that it was so fully innocent. Not innocent in a sentimental sense, as though every person there had to be angelic to deserve mourning, but innocent in the plain civic sense that they were entitled to live their day without being hunted. They were entitled to safety in a restaurant. They were entitled to complete a meal, a conversation, a work shift, the childhood. Their statement is a demand that we preserve that entitlement in memory even when the event itself violated it. And because this is a story told decades later, after the language of mass public violence has become tragically familiar, it is even more important to listen carefully. Familiarity can cheapen grief. Repetition can harden perception. We hear of shootings and our minds move too quickly to counts, motives, political aftermath, and exhausted commentary. But the victim's statement interrupts that hardening. It draws us back to the intimate scale on which catastrophe is actually suffered. It says, "I was not a statistic while I was dying. I was a person in pain and fear, in confusion, in love, in unfinished life. Remember me that way." So part 3 must end not with the killer's voice, but with the human chorus he tried to silence. A mother bending over a child. A worker turning in panic toward a place that yesterday meant safety. A family later staring at a doorway that will not open. A survivor carrying the shape of that afternoon in the nervous system for years. A community refusing to let its dead become faceless. This is the victim's statement of San Isidro. We were there in ordinary daylight, inside an ordinary place, doing ordinary things. And what was taken from us was not only life but the future attached to it. We were loved before the shooting and we remained loved after the headlines faded. The violence was sudden, but our lives were not. They stretched backward into memory and would have stretched forward into years. Hold that truth firmly, because the gunfire is coming, and when it does, this human fullness is what must not be lost. It began in broad daylight, under a sky so clear and pitiless that the whole afternoon seemed stripped of mystery. July 18, 1984 was hot in San Isidro, the kind of Southern California heat that settles onto asphalt, and lingers above parking lots in a wavering shimmer. The McDonald's stood in that brightness as it always had, a familiar box of color and routine, its windows taking in the glare, its doors opening and closing for customers who had no reason to hesitate. Inside, the sounds were ordinary enough to be almost invisible. The dull clatter of trays, the soft tear of wrappers, the hiss from the kitchen, the hum of machinery working against the heat, children shifting in their seats, employees moving in practiced arcs behind the counter. No one inside knew that a man was on his way carrying not only weapons but a decision already hardened beyond recall. He arrived armed and he arrived with intent. Whatever had rotted inside him before that moment had already ripened into action. By the time he approached the restaurant, this was no longer the chaos of a man losing control. It was the control of a man who had chosen chaos for everyone else. He'd brought with him a shotgun, a semi-automatic rifle, and ammunition enough to turn a place of lunch and cheddar into a field of slaughter. The fact that he came so prepared matters because it strips away every false softness people sometimes place around atrocity. This was not spontaneous. It was not a sudden fight that spiraled. It was not an argument that flared and became fatal. He did not stumble into horror. He carried it there. Outside vehicles still moved through the afternoon. Somewhere nearby, life continued with its usual indifference. That is how these moments so often begin, with one person stepping toward violence while the world around him remains almost offensively normal. A child in another car might have been asking for a toy. A driver at a traffic light might have been staring at the road ahead without a thought in his mind heavier than the heat. A neighbor might have been watering a patch of dust and grass. Then the man reached the McDonald's, and the boundary between ordinary time and nightmare vanished. The first moments of such an attack are always difficult to reconstruct emotionally because they happen faster than comprehension. Sound arrives before understanding. The body reacts before the mind catches up. People hear something wrong, but the human brain resists the truth at first. It searches for easier explanations. Maybe something fell. Maybe glass shattered. Maybe a car backfired. Maybe equipment burst. The denial lasts only seconds, but in those seconds lives still stand upright. Then the gunfire made itself unmistakable. The shots were not isolated or accidental. They came with force, rhythm, repetition. The sound ripped through the restaurant, splitting the air, breaking windows, tearing into bodies, turning instinct into chaos. In the time it takes a normal afternoon to blink, lunch became massacre. Customers who had been seated or standing in line were suddenly running, dropping, screaming, or freezing. Employees behind the counter were thrown out of routine and into terror. The killer moved into the restaurant and opened fire on the people before him, not as if he were aiming at enemies, but as if the very fact of human presence was enough. That is one of the darkest features of indiscriminate murder. It does not seek justice, revenge against a defined target, or even the warped intimacy of a personal crime. It seeks exposure. It looks at public life and decides to punish whoever is there. The first victims likely had almost no time even to understand what they were seeing. 1 second a person is lifting a cup, turning toward a child, glancing toward the counter. The next second the world is nothing but impact and noise. Bodies fell amid the furniture of everyday life. Chairs scraped and overturned, food trays dropped, glass burst. Somewhere a drink spilled across tile that, minutes earlier, had simply been clean floor beneath fluorescent light. The restaurant, so carefully arranged to guide customers through order, payment, eating, departure, was reorganized in an instant by panic. Booths became shelter or the illusion of shelter. Tables became obstacles. The open design, perfect for efficiency, offered too few places to disappear. Children cried or froze in confusion. Adults screamed for them, reached for them, tried to pull them down, tried to cover them. The killer kept shooting. There is no graceful way to describe what happens when a heavily armed man turns a room full of civilians into targets. The horror is not only in the blood and wounds. It is in the speed with which the fragile social contract of normal life is destroyed. People who had entered as customers and workers became, in his eyes, bodies to be broken. He fired into the restaurant, into the clustered life of it, and wherever those shots landed, families were torn open. Some victims died quickly. Others were wounded amid a confusion so complete that help seemed impossible. Parents acted on instinct. Some threw themselves over children. Some tried to drag them to cover. Some crouched low, using their own bodies as shields against bullets that no body can truly stop. Yet love does not calculate in such moments. It lunges. It folds itself over what it wants to protect. That is part of the incident too, inseparable from the killer's brutality. He brought death, but in the same room human beings answered with the oldest reflex of care they had. Employees trapped behind counters and in kitchen areas were forced to navigate a workplace suddenly transformed into a killing zone. Their knowledge of the layout, so useful in ordinary shifts, became desperate survival knowledge. Where is there cover? Where can I crawl? Is there a back exit? Is anyone alive over there? The ordinary objects of labor became part of a battlefield they had never imagined. A freezer door, a prep area, a divider, the edge of a counter, all became potential barriers against a force far more lethal than the room had ever been built to resist. The gunman did not stop after the first burst. This was not an eruption that ended as abruptly as it began. He sustained the terror. He moved, fired, and continued to hold people in mortal fear. That lengthening of time is central to the incident. What might seem brief in a summary can feel endless to those inside. Minutes stretch into a private eternity when each second carries the possibility of death. Survivors of such attacks often remember fragments rather than clean sequences, the thud of someone falling nearby, a child's voice cut off, the smell of gunpowder mixing with grease and soda syrup, the sight of shattered glass glittering where sunlight touched it, the sharp pain of knees or elbows hitting the floor as they crawled, the suffocating effort to stay silent while gunfire echoed through the room. The mind does not store catastrophe like a camera. It stores it like a wound in jagged pieces. And all the while, outside the building, people began to realize that something terrible was happening. Calls went out. Witnesses saw the gunman, heard the shots, saw people falling or fleeing. Panic widened beyond the restaurant walls. Yet for those inside, the outside world might as well have been another planet. The entire universe had shrunk to the dimensions of that McDonald's, to the spaces beneath tables, behind counters, beside the bodies of loved ones. Some tried to escape, some made it out. Others were cut down before they could. The randomness was savage. A step in one direction might save one life and end another. A chair, a booth, a second's hesitation, the exact angle of the shooter's movement, any of these could become the difference between survival and death. This is the terrible mechanics of mass killing. Fate begins to operate through details too small and senseless to bear. A family that chose one table instead of another. A child who slid beneath a seat at the right moment. An employee who ducked behind equipment seconds before a shot tore through the space where they had been standing. Meanwhile, the gunman continued his assault, as if determined not only to kill but to contaminate every corner of the restaurant with fear. The bright innocence of the place, its association with children and routine, became part of the obscenity. He had not stormed a bank, not confronted armed rivals, not entered some symbolic seat of power. He had chosen a McDonald's, a place built to attract families, and then filled it with gunfire. The scene inside became almost unbearable in its contrast. Children's meals, paper cups, plastic trays, the bright commercial cheer of a fast food chain, and among them the sudden collapse of wounded bodies, the cries of the injured, the desperate stillness of those pretending to be dead or trying not to draw attention. Some survivors later described using the dead as cover, a fact so horrifying that it speaks for itself. When a public space turns into a slaughterhouse, The human mind abandons dignity for survival because dignity belongs to peace. In moments like these, people flatten themselves against whatever might save them. They hold their breath. They do not move. They wait for the next shot, and then the next. The incident also unfolded under the pressure of official response. Law enforcement converged, but from the perspective of those inside, rescue could not arrive instantly, and certainty certainly could not. In the early confusion, officers had to determine what was happening, where the shooter was, whether there were hostages, whether there was more than one attacker. That delay, inevitable in such chaos, deepened the ordeal inside. The gunman held the space under his control, and everyone trapped there existed inside a long uncertainty. Was this about to end? Was he moving away? Had he seen them? Were the police outside? Would anyone come in time? Terror is not only the fear of death. It is the inability to measure how close death is or when it will return. Reports from such scenes often describe intermittent shooting, pauses that seemed almost worse because they invited a false hope that the danger had passed, followed by fresh gunfire that shattered that hope again. One can imagine the emotional whiplash inside the restaurant. Silence, if only for a moment, a held breath. Then shots again, loud enough to make the body flinch even before the ears fully registered them. Somewhere a wounded person may have moaned or called out, and then been forced into silence by fear or weakness. Somewhere a child may have tried to understand why a parent would not answer. The killer's movements inside the restaurant added another layer of dread. Fixed danger is terrifying enough. Moving danger is worse, because it turns the whole room into uncertainty. Every footstep, every shift of shadow, every fresh angle of fire becomes a threat. Survivors hidden beneath tables or behind counters would have had to listen as much as whoop, trying to map the gunman's position through sound. The scrape of boots, the blast of shots, the tinkle of more shattered glass, the brief, impossible thought that perhaps he had gone, followed by the reality that he was still there. The restaurant's ordinary brightness did not soften any of this. If anything, it made the violence more cruelly visible. There was no night to hide in, no darkness to blur the edges. This all happened in the glare of afternoon, within a room designed for exposure and efficiency. Even outside, the heat kept pressing down. Emergency vehicles arrived into a day that remained bright. The contrast between the climate and the human catastrophe sharpened the unreality. Catastrophe often feels impossible because the world around it does not look changed enough. The sky remains blue. The pavement remains hot. The sign outside still promises kneels and smiles. And yet inside, human life has been smashed apart. The shooting continued long enough to become not just an outburst but a siege. That matters because it turned the incident into a prolonged captivity of fear. The dead lay where they had fallen. The wounded bled where they could not be reached. Survivors remained trapped with the gunmen, with the bodies, with the sound of repeated fire, with the knowledge that a single movement could draw attention. Time inside such a room ceases to behave normally. Each second thickens, the mind races, and freezes at once. Some may have prayed. Some may have thought of children at home, of spouses, of mothers, of nothing coherent at all. In extreme terror, thought fragments. People become all nerve. The incident therefore cannot be told simply as a sequence of shots and responses. It was an assault on the senses, on the body's trust in space, on the moral expectation that public places belong to the living. Eventually, the standoff approached its end not through the gunman's remorse, because there was none, but through force from outside. Law enforcement, having taken position and assessed the scene as best they could in the chaos, confronted the reality that the killer remained armed inside a restaurant full of dead, dying, and terrified survivors. The situation had to end, but ending it required precision under pressure. A single shot from outside, fired by a police marksman, finally struck the gunman and stopped the massacre. The incident ended as abruptly for him as it had begun for his victims. But the damage inside the restaurant did not end when the shooting stopped. What remained was not relief in any clean sense. Relief in such a place is tangled with shock, disbelief, and the first horrible understanding of scale. Survivors who had been motionless, or whispering, or too afraid to breathe deeply, now faced the aftermath around them. The silence after prolonged gunfire can be one of the most devastating sounds in the world because it is filled with what is no longer happening. No more footsteps, no more shots, no more screaming. And in that emptiness the truth begins to settle. The restaurant had become a scene of overwhelming loss. 21 people were dead. Many others were wounded. Families had been shattered in one of the most ordinary places imaginable. Children had been among the victims. The fluorescent room that had smelled of fries and sweet soda now held blood, spent ammunition, broken glass, overturned furniture, and the stunned remains of ordinary life interrupted at its most vulnerable point. Emergency responders entered not into a crime scene that was merely violent, but into one that had been almost unspeakably intimate in its destruction. Bodies lay where meals should have continued. Paper wrappers and children's food containers sat near the dead. The closeness of domestic routine and slaughter gave the room an almost sacrilegious quality. This was not war in any conventional sense. No one there had agreed to risk. No one had come armed for conflict. They had come for lunch or work. That was the full cruelty of the incident. It invaded the unguarded. It punished the innocent in a place built around trust. And so part for ends not at the moment a shooter fell, but in the stillness that followed when people outside finally rushed toward those inside. When the scale of the massacre began to reveal itself, and when the McDonald's in San Isidro ceased forever to be merely a restaurant. After that afternoon, every window, every booth, every patch of floor inside that building would belong not to routine but to memory. The incident had lasted less than an afternoon. Its consequences would outlive decades. By the time the gunfire stopped, the McDonald's in San Isidro no longer looked like a restaurant in any human sense of the word. It looked like an ordinary place that had been forced to witness something too large, too cruel, too sudden for its walls to contain. The first thing the crime scene offered was contradiction. Bright commercial colors still clung to surfaces. The architecture remained recognizably domestic in its purpose, built for families, children, quick meals, and routine. Yet inside that familiar shell lay devastation so complete that the room seemed split between two realities. One reality still belonged to the world of lunch counters and paper trays. The other belonged to violent death. It is often said that crime scenes tell stories. In San Isidro, the scene did not tell one story so much as hundreds of interrupted ones, all cut short in the same terrible hour. The floor held bodies, blood, shattered glass, spent casings, dropped food, and the small everyday objects that become unbearable once they are found beside the dead. A tray left where a hand had let it fall, a cup overturned, liquid spreading and drying in the heat of the room. A child's meal abandoned not because appetite faded but because catastrophe stepped through the door. A chair twisted at an angle no diner would ever choose. The whole place carried the evidence of ordinary life stopped in mid-motion. That is one of the most haunting qualities of such crime scenes. They do not merely show what violence did. They preserve what life had been doing just before the violence arrived. The first responders who entered after the gunman was brought down did not walk into a mystery in the classic sense. The broad outline of what had happened was already horribly clear. A heavily armed man had entered a restaurant and slaughtered the people inside. Yet clarity on that scale only deepened the emotional force of the details. There was no hidden chamber to uncover, no clever puzzle to solve before the room could reveal its meaning. Meaning was everywhere, too visible, too immediate. The dead lay among the artifacts of a weekday afternoon. Some had fallen where they had tried to run. Some where they had crouched or sheltered children. Some where they had simply been sitting a moment earlier. doing nothing more dangerous than eating lunch. For investigators and emergency personnel, the initial challenge was not identifying that a crime had occurred, but confronting the magnitude of it while beginning the disciplined work that violent scenes demand. The crime scene had to be secured, documented, entered methodically, and interpreted through evidence, even though the emotional truth of the massacre was almost overwhelming on sight. Outside the restaurant, the scene spread outward in widening rings of emergency. Police vehicles, rescue units, barriers, shouted instructions. And the gathering shock of a neighborhood realizing that something unspeakable had taken place all created a perimeter of tension around the building. Families were already beginning to move toward the site or toward hospitals, trying to learn who had been inside and who had survived. The air outside would have felt charged in a different way than the air inside. Outside there was noise, movement, command, confusion. Inside there was aftermath. Inside there was the strange stillness that follows prolonged terror when the body of the event remains, but its motion has stopped. That stillness is deceptive. It looks calm, but it is the calm of rupture. Every object in the room had become evidence. Every footprint, casing, bullet mark, bloodstain, broken pane, and displaced chair formed part of the anatomy of the massacre. The first clues were brutally direct. There were the firearms the gunmen had brought, their presence making plain that this was no spontaneous outburst but a prepared attack. There was the pattern of shell casing showing where he had moved and where he had fired. There were bullet impacts in windows, walls, counters, furniture, and bodies, each one helping investigators reconstruct the geometry of the violence. In many homicides, clues begin as whispers. A missing object, a strange fiber, a footprint where none should be, a partial fingerprint on a doorknob. At San Isidro, the scene did not whisper, it shouted. But even in a crime so visually catastrophic, the disciplined interpretation of physical evidence mattered. It was necessary not because there was doubt that a massacre had occurred, but because the dead deserved accuracy, the wounded deserved clarity, and the record of what happened needed to be built from fact as well as horror. The bodies themselves formed part of the first and most painful layer of clues. Their positions told of attempted flight, of collapse, of shielding, of panic, of moments in which human instinct had taken over. A parent found over a child was not merely a victim, but a final act made visible. A worker discovered behind the counter or deeper in the work area revealed where employees had tried to retreat when their workplace became a trap. A cluster of victims in one section could indicate how people had moved together under pressure, or where they believed cover might exist even when the architecture could not truly protect them. Crime scenes are often read spatially, and this one, in all its horror, offered a terrible map of fear. There were places where people had hoped to survive, places where they had fallen before reaching shelter, places where they had waited motionless, perhaps pretending death in order not to attract it. Bloodstain patterns, though clinical in the language of forensic work, carried their own grim testimony. They marked where initial wounds occurred, where bodies came to rest, where survivors may have dragged themselves, crawled, or been moved in the first rush of rescue. Pools and trails of blood turned the floor into a record of suffering. On clean tile meant for quick-service dining, these stains transformed the space into something almost impossible to reconcile with its former purpose. And yet it was exactly that dissonance that made the scene so unforgettable. A crime scene in an abandoned warehouse already carries a certain menace. A crime scene in a bright restaurant built for children carries betrayal. The light itself became a coup of sorts. This had happened not under cover of darkness, but in broad afternoon brightness. The large windows that normally advertised safety and openness had been shattered, and their broken glass reflected both the violence inside and the helpless exposure of those trapped within. Sunlight reaching through damaged panes must have fallen across blood, empty seats, abandoned food, and bodies. That visual contradiction belongs to the evidence too. Public massacres often leave behind scenes that feel unreal precisely because they preserve the everyday setting so clearly. Nothing about the room had the dignity of dramatic staging. It was commercially ordinary to the end, and that ordinariness intensified the obscenity of what had been done there. Investigators would also have noted the absence of traditional signs that accompany more personal murders. There was no evidence of struggle rooted in mutual conflict, no sign of a dispute between known parties escalating out of control, no hidden entry suggesting stealthy intrusion for a singular target, no attempt by the killer to conceal the bodies, clean the scene, or erase himself from it. Everything about the physical evidence pointed in the opposite direction. This was overt violence, public violence, violence meant to rupture and overwhelm. The killer had not tried to obscure what he was doing. The arrangement of evidence showed that he had brought death into the open and inflicted it with deliberate force. That itself was an important clue, not about identity perhaps, because his presence and death at the scene resolved that question quickly, but about mental state and intention. The weapons, the volume of fire, the choice of location, the lack of concealment, the sustained duration of the attack, all spoke to a perpetrator whose aim was maximum human devastation rather than escape, theft, or intimate revenge. The first investigative clues came not only from objects, but from survivors. Survivors in the immediate aftermath are witnesses, but they are also wounded minds. Their statements are rarely neat, especially after an event so chaotic. Some may remember the gunman's entrance, some the first bursts of fire, some only fragments, a hand, a scream, broken glass, the sight of a loved one dropping, the sensation of pressing their face to the floor while trying not to breathe too loudly. Investigators had to begin gathering those fragments even as shock still held the witnesses in its grip. This process is always delicate. Trauma fractures sequence. People remember sound before sight, terror before chronology. Yet when many such fragments are placed together, a pattern begins to emerge. In San Isidro, those early witness accounts would have confirmed both the terrifying speed of the initial assault and the prolonged fear that followed. They would have helped establish the gunman's movements through the restaurant, the locations where he fired, and the desperate choices made by those trying to hide or escape. The voices of survivors became clues not because they softened the forensic record, but because they gave it motion. Shell casings can show where shots were fired. Witnesses can reveal what those shots did to a room full of human beings. Outside witnesses mattered too. People who had seen the gunman approach, heard the first reports, observed broken windows, fleeing victims, or police positions added another ring of evidence around the inner core of the restaurant. A public crime leaves witnesses in layers. There are those at the center, those just beyond it, those arriving in the first moments after, those hearing but not yet seeing. In San Isidro, all of these layers contributed to the immediate understanding of the massacre. Yet the deeper emotional core of the crime scene remained inside the building itself. There, the smallest objects became almost unbearable clues. In the aftermath of mass murder, the trivial becomes sacred because it is attached to the dead, a napkin near a body, a shoe out of place, a child's item resting where no child would have willingly left it. These are not clues in the dramatic detective sense, but they are clues to life interrupted. They reveal who was there, how suddenly the attack took hold, and how little time the victims had to comprehend what was happening. The restaurant's kitchen and service areas offered their own story. Behind the counter, the familiar geometry of labor had been turned into a maze of desperation. Investigators would have looked closely at the positions of employees, signs of movement toward rear areas, and the marks left by bullets through workspaces never designed to withstand such assault. Fast food kitchens are cramped, practical, and efficient, built around repetition and speed. In catastrophe, those same features can trap as much as protect. The evidence there would have reflected that terrible inversion. A place associated with preparation and service had become a place of hiding, crawling, bleeding, and death. The counter itself, ordinarily a boundary between customer and staff, became something else under gunfire, a flimsy partition between life and annihilation. Broken equipment, impact marks, and traces of hurried movement would have shown how those inside tried to use the workplace against the attack, even when the design gave them so little chance. Then there were the weapon clues. The gunman had arrived with multiple firearms and substantial ammunition, and that alone signaled preparation. The specific presence of a shotgun and a semi-automatic rifle shaped the carnage in different ways, each weapon contributing its own pattern of destruction. Investigators at the scene could read the floor and walls through that lens. Certain damage would align with blasts from one weapon, other patterns with sustained fire from another. Even where the broad moral facts were obvious, this type of forensic distinction mattered. It established sequence, position, and the mechanics of the killings. It also reinforced the reality that the massacre had not emerged from a sudden grab for whatever weapon happened to be nearby. The killer had arrived equipped to overwhelm. That was one of the first and most damning clues to intention. In another kind of case, investigators might search for a motive through hidden relationships, insurance papers, letters, fingerprints on a window latch, or inconsistencies in an alibi. At San Isidro, the clue trail toward motive was less buried but no less chilling. The target itself was a clue. A McDonald's full of civilians during the day is not selected by accident when one is armed to this degree. Such a place speaks of symbolic vulnerability. It offers density of victims, public exposure, and the contamination of innocence. The presence of children was not incidental to the horror. It was embedded in the nature of the location. Anyone attacking such a place knows, or ought to know, that families will be inside. That makes the choice of scene one of the earliest psychological clues. It points towards someone not simply wishing to kill, but willing to desecrate the ordinary and the child-centered, willing to turn a bright public space into a theater of fear. The physical layout of the scene also helped reveal why the death toll was so terrible. The restaurant's open seating area, broad windows, limited hard cover, and concentrated lunchtime occupancy created a lethal environment once the shooting began. Investigators, reading the scene, would have understood how architecture and timing had amplified the slaughter. This was not because the building caused the crime. It did not. But its design, meant for hospitality and convenience, offered little refuge once violence entered. The crime scene therefore held not just evidence of what the gunman did, but evidence of how vulnerable ordinary public spaces can become when their assumptions of peace are shattered. Among their earliest clues, too, was the final one that ended the event: the gunman himself lying dead inside the restaurant after being shot by law enforcement. His death closed off some questions while intensifying others. It meant there would be no long interrogation, no courtroom testimony, no performance of explanation from the man who had done this. Investigators could examine his body, his weapons, his possessions, his movements, but they could not demand from him the moral accounting the dead deserved. In some ways that absence simplified the legal landscape. In others it deepened the emotional void. The scene itself would have to speak more fully because the perpetrator was no longer there to be confronted, only interpreted. And so the first clues became not just forensic but existential. Who chooses this? Who arms himself like this? Who enters a restaurant full of strangers and children and keeps firing? The answers would later be sought in biography and psychology. But at the scene the evidence already whispered something essential. This was a man who had transformed private collapse into public massacre. As the hours passed and the crime scene was processed, each photograph taken and each measurement recorded became part of a necessary act of preservation. Such preservation is emotionally difficult because it requires investigators to look steadily where others instinctively want to look away. Yet without that steadiness, the dead risk a second erasure. The work of documentation says that every victim mattered enough to be accounted for precisely, every wound mattered enough to be explained. Every movement of the killer mattered enough to be fixed in record. In San Isidro, that work unfolded amid one of the most harrowing crime scenes the country had yet seen. By the end of that first phase, the initial clues had established a truth both simple and shattering. This had been a planned mass killing carried out in a bright public restaurant against ordinary people whose greatest mistake was being present at the wrong hour. The scene offered no hidden elegance, no cleverness, no puzzle worthy of admiration. It offered only devastation, the stark geometry of indiscriminate death, and the small abandoned traces of lives that should have continued long after lunch. The McDonald's in San Isidro had become not just a location, but an archive of innocence violated, and every shard of glass, every casing, every stain on the tile, every fallen body and unfinished meal bore witness to that fact. In most homicide investigations, Part 6 is where the story narrows. Detectives pin photographs to boards, circle names, compare alibis, and move through a dark corridor of possible faces until one face begins to hold more shadow than the rest. The San Isidro massacre did not unfold that way. There was no elegant parade of suspects, no dinner table circle of secrets, no rival versions of the same night waiting to be broken apart by one decisive contradiction. The man who carried out the massacre died at the scene, in one sense, that closed the central question immediately. In another, it opened a different and more uncomfortable one. If the perpetrator was already dead, then what exactly was left to investigate? The answer was everything around the act. Not the identity of the shooter, but the chain of collapse that led to him, the possibility of accomplices, the logic of his target, the warnings that had not become intervention, the private grievances that had swollen into public slaughter, and the painful task of turning chaos into an official record. This was an investigation without the usual suspense but not without tension, because the absence of a living suspect often produces a different kind of dead end. The dead do not explain themselves. They leave behind rooms, receipts, memories, statements from those who knew them, objects in drawers, neighbors who noticed something odd too late, family members forced to answer for a darkness they did not create, and a silence in the place where motive ought to be. When investigators entered that silence after San Isidro, they found not a grand criminal conspiracy but a wrecked human life that had chosen to become catastrophic for others. Yet they could not assume even that at the start. In the first hours after a public massacre, certainty is smaller than it appears from a distance. The shooter was down, yes, but the scale of the attack, the number of weapons, the public setting, and the terror of the witnesses left room for immediate doubt. Had he acted alone? Were there additional gunmen? Had anyone helped him plan it? Was this a targeted act against the restaurant, against the neighborhood, against some imagined enemy group? Or was it the expression of a mind that had abandoned distinctions altogether? At the scene and just beyond it, such questions were not abstract. They shaped police posture, neighborhood fear, and the early tempo of the investigation. A massacre that appears simple in hindsight often feels sprawling in real time. Rumors bloom fast in public bloodshed because the human mind hates open terror and rushes to fill it with explanation. Someone heard there were two men, someone saw another vehicle. Someone thought the shooter said something that implied a partner. Someone outside glimpsed movement and mistook panic for coordination. These are not failures of honesty. They are the natural distortions of people trying to understand something extreme while still inside its shock wave. Investigators had to move carefully through those fragments, separating terror-born confusion